In the ancient world, when nations rose and fell by the strength of their armies and the wisdom of their kings, there lived a woman whose story would shatter every expectation of her time. Picture this. While other civilizations relegated women to the shadows of history, Israel had a leader who commanded armies, dispensed justice, and spoke directly with the Almighty. Her name was Deborah, and her story is one of the most extraordinary accounts of courage, faith, and divine calling ever recorded. But here's what makes this even more incredible. Deborah wasn't just breaking barriers as a female leader in a male-dominated world, she was simultaneously fulfilling four of the most important roles in ancient Israel: prophetess, judge, military commander, and worship leader. Think about that for a moment. In our modern world, we struggle to balance just one demanding career. Yet, Deborah mastered four of the most challenging positions imaginable, all while leading a nation through one of its darkest periods. Today, we're going to dive deep into the remarkable life of this biblical powerhouse. We'll explore how a woman in ancient times rose to become Israel's supreme leader, how she orchestrated one of the most brilliant military victories in history, and why her story continues to inspire leaders around the world thousands of years later. By the end of this journey, you'll understand not just who Deborah was, but how her example of fearless leadership can transform your own approach to the challenges you face. But first, let me set the stage for you, because Deborah's story doesn't happen in a vacuum. It unfolds during one of the most chaotic and dangerous periods in Israel's history. The time is approximately 1150 BCE, and Israel finds itself trapped in a vicious cycle that has plagued the nation for generations. The people would follow God, experience prosperity and peace, then gradually drift away from their faith. This spiritual decline would lead to moral corruption, which would weaken the nation and make it vulnerable to foreign oppression. When the suffering became unbearable, the people would cry out to God for help. He would raise up a deliverer called a judge, and the cycle would begin all over again. During Deborah's era, Israel had been groaning under the iron fist of Jabin, the king of Canaan, for 20 long years. But this wasn't just any ordinary oppression. Jabin possessed something that struck terror into the hearts of every Israelite: 900 iron chariots commanded by his ruthless general, Sisera. To put this in perspective, iron chariots in the ancient world were like modern tanks. They were virtually unstoppable on flat terrain, capable of crushing infantry formations and spreading panic throughout enemy ranks. The Israelites, primarily armed with bronze weapons and fighting on foot, had no answer for this technological superiority. For 2 decades, they lived in constant fear, unable to travel the main roads, forced to use winding mountain paths to avoid Sisera's patrols. Their economy was crippled, their morale shattered, and their faith hanging by a thread. It was into this desperate situation that God called Deborah to leadership. But who was this remarkable woman before she became Israel's deliverer? The biblical account introduces Deborah with a fascinating description in Judges 4:4. She is called Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth. Now this simple introduction packs more punch than you might realize. The Hebrew word for prophetess here is nava, which means she was recognized as someone who received direct revelations from God and could speak his words with absolute authority. But here's where it gets interesting. In the ancient Near East, female prophets weren't entirely unknown, but they were rare. What made Deborah unique was that she combined this prophetic gift with judicial authority. The text tells us she was judging Israel at that time, holding court under what became known as the Palm of Deborah, between Ramah and Bethlehem, in the hill country of Ephraim. Picture this scene. People from all over Israel making the difficult journey to seek her wisdom and judgment. Merchants with trade disputes, families with inheritance conflicts, individuals seeking divine guidance for major life decisions, all of them climbing the rocky paths to sit under that palm tree and hear the word of the Lord through this extraordinary woman. What's remarkable is that in a culture where women typically had limited legal rights, Deborah wielded supreme judicial authority. The Israelites didn't just tolerate her leadership, they sought it out, traveling from distant tribes to benefit from her wisdom and divine insight. This tells us something profound about her character and reputation. She must have demonstrated such exceptional wisdom, fairness, and spiritual discernment that even the most traditional members of society accepted her authority. But Deborah's role as judge went far beyond settling disputes. In ancient Israel, judges weren't just legal officials. They were charismatic leaders raised up by God to deliver the nation from its enemies and restore proper worship. They combined executive, judicial, and military functions in ways that would be unthinkable in our modern separation of powers. The name Deborah itself is significant. It means bee in Hebrew, and just as bees are known for their industrious nature and ability to organize complex societies, Deborah would prove to be a master organizer and strategic thinker. She would need every bit of this skill for the monumental challenge that lay ahead. As Deborah sat under her alm tree dispensing justice and receiving divine revelations, she began to understand that God was preparing to break the chains of Canaanite oppression. But the plan he revealed to her was unlike anything Israel had attempted before. It would require her to step beyond her role as judge and prophetess and take on yet another unprecedented position, military commander. The divine strategy that unfolded in Deborah's mind was both brilliant and terrifying. God would use Israel's apparent weakness to turn Sisera's greatest strength against him. Those 900 iron chariots that had terrorized the countryside for 20 years would become a liability rather than an asset. But executing this plan would require perfect timing, absolute faith, and the kind of leadership that could unite a fractured nation around a seemingly impossible mission. This is where Deborah's character truly shines through the historical record. She didn't hesitate or make excuses when God revealed his plan. She didn't complain about the magnitude of the challenge or point out all the reasons why it couldn't work. Instead, she immediately began taking action to implement the divine strategy. Her first step was to summon Barak, the son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali. Now Barak was already recognized as a capable military leader among the northern tribes, but what Deborah was about to ask of him would test his faith and courage to the absolute limit. She called him to her court under the palm tree and delivered a message that would change the course of Israel's history. The conversation that followed reveals everything we need to know about both leaders. Deborah spoke with the authority of divine revelation, her words carrying the weight of heaven itself. She told Barak that the Lord, the God of Israel, was commanding him to take 10,000 men from the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun and deploy them on Mount Tabor. There, God would draw out Sisera with his chariots and troops to the Kishon River, where he would deliver them into Barak's hands. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Barak, this experienced military commander, looked at this prophetess and made a statement that would echo through history. If you go with me, I will go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go. Now, some have interpreted Barak's response as cowardice, but I think that misses the deeper truth of what was happening here. Barak wasn't afraid of battle. He was a seasoned warrior who understood military strategy. What he recognized was that this wasn't going to be won through conventional tactics or superior firepower. This was going to require divine intervention, and Deborah was God's chosen vessel for receiving and implementing that intervention. Barak was essentially saying, I trust your connection with God more than my own military experience. If God is going to give us victory, I need his prophetess on the battlefield with us. This shows remarkable spiritual insight and humility from a man who could have let pride dictate his response. Deborah's reply is equally revealing of her character. She didn't rebuke Barak for his condition or question his courage. Instead, she agreed to accompany him, but she added a prophetic warning that would prove significant. Very well, I will go with you, but because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. This prophecy contains layers of meaning that wouldn't become clear until the battle was over. On the surface, it might seem like Deborah was claiming the military glory for herself, but as we'll see, God had an even more dramatic twist in store, one that would involve another remarkable woman whose quick thinking and courage would seal Israel's victory. What's fascinating about this exchange is how it reveals the partnership that was about to unfold. Deborah brought the divine revelation and strategic vision. Barak brought military expertise and tribal connections. Together, they would accomplish what neither could have achieved alone. This wasn't just about one great leader, it was about the power of collaborative leadership under divine guidance. As word spread throughout the northern tribes that Deborah and Barak were calling for volunteers to fight against Sisera, something remarkable began to happen. For 20 years, the people had lived in fear, avoiding the main roads hiding in the mountains, accepting their oppression as inevitable. But now, hearing that the prophetess who spoke for God was personally leading this campaign, men began to respond. The response wasn't universal, and we'll explore later how some tribes chose to stay home while others answered the call. But among those who came, there was a spirit of desperate hope mixed with absolute determination. These weren't professional soldiers. They were farmers, shepherds, craftsmen, and traders who had finally reached their breaking point with foreign domination. Picture the scene as these volunteers gathered at the designated assembly points. Men leaving their fields unharvested, their shops closed, their families worried but proud. They came carrying whatever weapons they could find. Ancient bronze swords passed down from their grandfathers, farming tools hastily sharpened into spears, bows that hadn't been used for anything more dangerous than hunting rabbits, against Sisera's professional army with their iron weapons and terrifying chariots. They looked hopelessly outmatched. But here's what made the difference. They weren't just following a military commander into battle. They were following a woman who spoke directly with the God of their ancestors, who had demonstrated her wisdom and divine connection for years under that palm tree. When Deborah said God would give them victory, they believed her with a faith that transcended their circumstances. The gathering itself was a logistical masterpiece. Coordinating 10,000 men from different tribes, each with their own customs and leadership structures, required the kind of organizational skills that Deborah had been developing throughout her years as judge. She had to ensure they had adequate supplies, establish communication systems, and most critically maintain morale in the face of what seemed like impossible odds. As the army assembled, Deborah began implementing the divine strategy that had been revealed to her. Mount Tabor, the location God had specified, was a fascinating choice. Rising about 1,900 feet above the surrounding plain, it offered commanding views of the entire Jezreel Valley. More importantly, its steep, rocky slopes made it completely inaccessible to chariots. Sisera's greatest weapon would be useless against an army positioned on Tabor's heights. But the real genius of the plan went deeper than just defensive positioning. Mount Tabor sat at the intersection of several tribal territories, making it symbolically significant as a place where Israel could unite against their common enemy. Its location also meant that news of the Israelite mobilization would quickly reach Sisera's intelligence network, which was exactly what God wanted to happen. Meanwhile, in his fortress city of Haroseth-Hagoyim, Sisera was receiving reports of this unusual military buildup. His spies brought word of thousands of Israelite men gathering around Mount Tabor, led by their female judge and a warrior named Barak. For a moment, Sisera must have been Israelites' attempt anything so bold or coordinated, but puzzled. In 20 years of dominating this region, he had never seen the third, and his strategic mind began to work. Here was an opportunity to crush Israel's spirit once and for all. Instead of these rebels hiding in caves and conducting guerrilla raids, they had foolishly gathered in one place where his chariots could reach them. He could end this rebellion in a single decisive battle and make an example that would prevent any future uprisings for generations. Sisera began mobilizing his entire force, all 900 iron chariots plus thousands of infantry. This wasn't just going to be a punitive raid. This was going to be total war aimed at breaking Israel's will to resist permanently. He planned to deploy his chariots in the valley below Mount Tabor, where their mobility and shock value would be maximized. The Israelites would either have to come down and face annihilation in the open or starve on the mountain while watching their villages burn. What Sisera didn't understand was that he was walking directly into a divine trap, the timing, the location, even his decision to bring his entire force. Everything was unfolding exactly as God had revealed to Deborah, but the most critical element of the plan was still hidden, even from the Israelites themselves. As both armies moved into position, the stage was set for one of the most dramatic reversals in military history. On Mount Tabor, Deborah moved among the troops, strengthening their resolve and preparing them for what was to come. Her presence on the battlefield was unprecedented. Prophets typically delivered God's messages from a safe distance, not from the front lines of combat. But Deborah understood something profound about leadership that many modern executives and politicians never grasp. True authority comes not from position or title, but from shared risk and demonstrated commitment. By placing herself in the same danger as her troops, she earned a level of loyalty and trust that no amount of inspiring speeches could have achieved. The night before the battle, as 10,000 Israelite warriors tried to sleep on the rocky slopes of Mount Tabor, they could see the glow of enemy campfires spread across the valley below like fallen stars. Sisera's massive army was so large that their fires extended for miles in every direction. The sight should have been terrifying, but instead, many of the Israelites found themselves filled with a strange confidence. They had seen Deborah's absolute certainty that God would give them victory. They had witnessed her calm preparations, her careful attention to every detail, her complete lack of doubt about the outcome. When a leader demonstrates that kind of unshakable faith, it becomes contagious. The troops began to believe, not just in their cause, but in their inevitable success. Deborah spent that night moving through the camp, speaking with unit commanders, offering encouragement to nervous soldiers, and continuing to receive divine guidance about the timing of their attack. She knew that everything depended on launching their assault at precisely the right moment. Too early, and they would face Sisera's chariots on firm ground where they held every advantage. Too late, and they might miss the divine intervention that would turn the tide. As dawn approached, Deborah felt the unmistakable prompting of God's Spirit. The moment had arrived. She found Barak and delivered the words that would launch one of history's most remarkable victories. Go. This is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you? What happened next defied every principle of ancient warfare. Instead of waiting for the enemy to attack their fortified position, the Israelites charged down the mountain straight toward Sisera's chariots. To any observer, it looked like mass suicide. Foot soldiers running downhill toward Iron Shah, Ayats on flat ground. It should have been a massacre that ended in minutes. But as the Israelites descended Mount Tabor, with their war cries echoing across the valley, something extraordinary began to happen. The clear morning sky suddenly darkened with clouds that seemed to appear from nowhere. Within minutes, rain began to fall. Not the gentle showers of an ordinary storm, but torrential downpours that turned the entire battlefield into a muddy quagmire. The Kishon River, normally a small stream meandering through the valley, began to swell with runoff from the surrounding hills. The carefully prepared battlefield where Sisera had planned to deploy his chariots became a swamp where heavy iron wheels sank into the mud and horses struggled to maintain their footing. In that moment, every advantage shifted to the Israelites. The chariots that had terrorized the countryside for 20 years became death traps for their crews. Horses panicked in the mud, chariot wheels broke under the strain, and Sisera's disciplined formations dissolved into chaos. The Israelites, fighting on foot and accustomed to difficult terrain, pressed their attack with devastating effectiveness, but the most dramatic moment was still to come. As his army disintegrated around him, Sisera made a desperate decision that would lead to his final downfall. Abandoning his useless chariot, he fled on foot toward what he believed would be safety. His destination was the tent of Jael, the wife of Heberteh, whose family had maintained neutrality in the conflict between Israel and Canaan. What Sisera didn't realize was that his flight would bring him face to face with another extraordinary woman, whose courage would complete the victory that Deborah had orchestrated. The story was about to take its most unexpected turn, fulfilling the prophecy that the honor of defeating Sisera would belong to a woman, but not the omen anyone expected. As Sisera stumbled through the mud and chaos of his defeated army, his mind raced with desperate calculations. Where could he find sanctuary? Who among the local inhabitants might offer protection to the once mighty commander of Canaan's forces? In his panic, he remembered the Kenites, a nomadic people who had maintained careful neutrality in the ongoing conflicts between Israel and the Canaanite kingdoms. The Kenites were metalworkers and traders, their skills too valuable for either side to alienate permanently. Here the Kenite had pitched his tents near Kadesh, having separated from his kinsmen to establish his own trading post in this strategic location. More importantly for Sisera's immediate needs, there was a treaty of peace between Jabin, king of Canaan, and Heber's clan. Surely here he would find the refuge he desperately needed. But what Sisera failed to understand in his desperate flight was the complex web of loyalties and relationships that defined life in ancient Canaan. Treaties between kings meant little to individuals who had witnessed 20 years of oppression. While Heber might have maintained official neutrality, His wife Jael had developed her own perspective on the conflict that had torn their region apart for 2 decades. Jael was no ordinary woman, even by the standards of her time. As a Kenite, she belonged to a people who valued independence and self-reliance above tribal loyalties. The Kenites were descendants of Moses' father-in-law, maintaining ancient connections to Israel while preserving their own distinct identity. They were skilled in metalwork, diplomacy, and survival, traits that required both physical courage and mental acuity. Living as nomads on the borderlands between great powers, Kenite women like Jael had learned to be resourceful, decisive, and capable of protecting their families when their husbands were away on trading expeditions. They couldn't afford the luxury of helplessness or dependence that characterized women in more settled, protected societies. Survival demanded strength, and Jael possessed it in abundance. As Sisera posed her tent, exhausted and desperate, Jael faced a moment that would test every aspect of her character. Here was the man whose iron chariots had terrorized the countryside, whose troops had oppressed innocent people, whose very name struck fear into the hearts of mothers throughout the region. Yet he was also a guest seeking hospitality protected by ancient codes that made harming a visitor a grave violation of honor. What happened next reveals the complexity of ancient Middle Eastern culture and the extraordinary courage of women who lived in those turbulent times. When Sisera called out for help, Gil emerged from her tent and issued an invitation that would change everything. "Come, my lord. Come right in. Don't be afraid." The words were carefully chosen. By addressing him as my lord, she showed the proper respect due to his rank, even in defeat. By inviting him inside and telling him not to fear, she offered the protection that hospitality laws demanded. To Sisera, it must have seemed like divine providence, safety found just when all hope seemed lost. Jael brought him milk instead of water, a gesture of honor that went beyond basic hospitality. She covered him with a blanket, providing comfort and concealment from any pursuers who might be searching for him. When Sisera asked her to stand guard at the tent entrance and deny his presence to anyone who inquired, she agreed without hesitation. Everything seemed to be proceeding exactly as he had hoped. But beneath this veneer of traditional hospitality, something far more complex was unfolding. Gil was not simply a passive provider of refuge. She was making strategic decisions that would determine the fate of the man who had brought so much suffering to her region. The milk, the blanket, the promise to stand guard. Each gesture bought her time to consider her options and plan her next move. As Sisera lay in her tent, exhaustion finally overcoming his fear, he had no idea that he was about to encounter a resolve as unshakable as Deborah's, and a courage as deadly as any warrior's. The skills that made Jael's people master metalworkers, steady hands, precise timing, and intimate knowledge of tools and their uses were about to be employed in a way that would shock the ancient world. While Caesar slept, believing himself safe under the protection of hospitality laws, Jael picked up a tent peg and a hammer. These were not weapons of war, but tools of daily life, implements that any nomadic woman would handle regularly in the process of setting up and breaking down camp. In Jael's experienced hands, however, they were about to become instruments of divine justice. The moment that followed has been debated by scholars and theologians for millennia. Some see Jael's actions as a violation of sacred hospitality codes, while others view them as the righteous execution of divine judgment. What cannot be disputed is the courage required to take such decisive action against one of the most feared military commanders of the age. With steady hands that showed no trembling, Jael approached the sleeping general. The tent peg was positioned with deadly precision, and the hammer fell with the force of 20 years of accumulated anger at the oppression Sisera represented. The blow was struck with such skill that Sisera died instantly, never knowing what had ended his life or who had delivered the fatal stroke. When Barak arrived at Jael's tent, still in pursuit of his defeated enemy, he found not a fugitive general, but a corpse and a woman whose calm demeanor spoke of absolute conviction in her actions. "Come," Jael said to him, "I will show you the man you're looking for." The scene that greeted Barak fulfilled Deborah's prophecy in the most unexpected way possible. The honor of victory over Sisera had indeed gone to a woman, but not the woman anyone had anticipated. The news of Sisera's death spread through both armies like wildfire. For the fleeing Canaanites, it marked the complete collapse of their military power and the end of their 20-year domination of the region. For the pursuing Israelites, It confirmed that their stunning victory was indeed the work of divine intervention, orchestrated through the courage and wisdom of two remarkable women. But the implications of this victory extended far beyond the immediate military situation. The defeat of Sisera and the destruction of his chariot force sent shockwaves throughout the ancient Near East. Other Canaanite kings who had been considering their own campaigns against Israel suddenly found themselves reconsidering their plans. The people were demonstrated that their God was still capable of miraculous interventions on had seemed so weak and disorganized her, and began the process of pursuing the scattery occurred. The strategy that God had revealed to her had ungeneration. They had lived under the shadow of those 900 iron chariots, accepting their behalf. The psychological impact on Israel itself was equally profound, for oppression as inevitable, and viewing resistance as futile. Now they had witnessed the immediate aftermath of the battle as the Israelite forces restored their confidence, not just in their military capabilities, but in their identity as God's chosen people. Remnants of Sisera's army destruction of that seemingly invincible force through a combination of divine intervention and human courage. The victory folded with precision beyond anything human planning the storm. The transformation of the battlefield event, that the deeper meaning lay in what Deborah found herself processing the magnitude of what had just could have achieved. The timing of element had worked together to produce a victory so complete that it would be remembered for centuries. Yet, for all the Sisera's flight to Jael's tent, every military and political significance of what had happened, Deborah understood God who had delivered Israel from slavery in Egypt. This victory revealed about God's character and his relationship with his people. The same who had brought down the walls of Jericho, who had empowered judges like Gideon and Samson, had once again demonstrated his power to save through the most unlikely instruments. The fact that this deliverance had come through women, first through Deborah's prophetic leadership and strategic vision, then through Jael's decisive courage, challenged every assumption about power and authority in the ancient world. It demonstrated that God's ways were not constrained by human expectations or cultural limitations. When he chose to work through those whom society considered weak or marginal, his power was displayed even more dramatically. As word of the victory spread throughout Israel, communities that had lived in fear for 2 decades began to emerge from hiding. Roads that had been abandoned to Canaanite patrols saw the return of Israelite merchants and travelers. Villages that had paid tribute to foreign overlords began to rebuild their defenses and reclaim their independence. The transformation was not just military, but social, economic, and spiritual. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Israel had experienced in living memory. From Dan to Beersheba, from the Mediterranean coast to the Jordan River, the news traveled that the oppressor had been defeated and freedom had been restored. But this was merely a victory celebration. It was a renewal of national identity and purpose. Deborah, recognizing the significance of this moment, knew that the victory needed to be commemorated in a way that would preserve its memory for future generations. The story needed to be told not just as a military triumph, but as a testament to what was possible when ordinary people responded to divine calling with extraordinary faith and courage. What emerged from this recognition was one of the most beautiful and powerful pieces of ancient Hebrew poetry, a song that would capture not just the events of the battle, but the emotions, the faith, and the profound gratitude of a people who had experienced miraculous deliverance. This song would become known as the Song of Deborah, added examples of biblical literature. It would stand as one of the earliest and most vivid in the aftermath of Israel's stunning victory. As the dust settled and the reality of their deliverance began to sink in, Deborah felt the familiar stirring of prophetic inspiration, but this time it wasn't a revelation about military strategy or divine judgment. Instead, words began forming in her mind, words of celebration, gratitude, and remembrance that demanded to be given voice. The Song of Deborah, recorded in Judges chapter 5, stands as one of the oldest pieces of Hebrew poetry in existence. Biblical scholars believe it was composed immediately after the battle, while the emotions were still raw and the details still vivid in everyone's memory. This wasn't a sanitized historical account written decades later. This was the passionate, immediate response of a prophetess who had just witnessed the impossible become reality. But this song was more than just Deborah's personal expression of gratitude. It was a masterpiece of ancient literature that served multiple purposes simultaneously. It preserved the historical due Tales of what had happened celebrated the heroes who had risen to the occasion, called out those who had failed to respond, and most importantly, gave glory to the God who had orchestrated the entire victory. The opening lines set the tone with explosive joy and triumph. Deborah begins by calling all creation to witness what has transpired, summoning kings and rulers to hear the song she will sing to the Lord. There's an almost defiant quality to these words, as if she's daring anyone to question the power of Israel's God after what they had just witnessed. What makes the song particularly remarkable is how it weaves together the cosmic and the intimate, the divine and the human. Deborah describes how the very heavens participated in the battle, how the stars fought from their courses against Sisera. She paints a picture of creation itself, rising up in defense of God's people, with even the ancient river Kishon joining the fight by sweeping away Israel's enemies. Yet, alongside these cosmic images, the song includes deeply personal details that only someone who was present could have known. She describes the sound of chariot wheels pounding across the valley floor, the panic in the enemy's voice as their formations collapsed, the sight of Sisera's mother waiting at her window for a son who would never return home. The song also serves as a roll call of tribal loyalty and courage. Deborah names those who answered the call to battle, the tribes of Ephraim, Benjamin, Zebulun, Issachar, and Naphtali, praising their willingness to risk everything for their nation's freedom. She particularly honors Zebulun and Naphtali, noting that they risked their very lives on the heights of the battlefield. But the song doesn't shy away from naming those who failed to respond in Israel's hour of need. The tribes of Reuben, Dan, and Asher are called out for their absence, with Deborah's words carrying a sting of disappointment and reproach. This wasn't just military criticism. It was a moral judgment about the obligations of kinship and covenant community. The portrayal of Gil in the song reveals the complexity of how ancient peoples understood heroism and divine justice. Deborah doesn't minimize or apologize for Giles's violation of hospitality laws. Instead, she celebrates it as the climactic moment of God's judgment against Israel's oppressor. The detailed description of Sisera's death serves not as gratuitous violence, but as confirmation that divine justice, however it comes, is always perfect and complete. Perhaps most remarkably, the song includes a haunting portrayal of Sisera's mother waiting for her son's return. This section shows Deborah's profound understanding of human nature and the universal experience of loss. Even as she celebrates Israel's victory, she acknowledges the grief that victory has brought to others. It's a moment of startling empathy that reveals the depth of Deborah's character and wisdom. The song concludes with a prayer that has echoed through the centuries. So may all your enemies perish, Lord, but may all who love you be like the sun when it rises in its strength. These words capture the essence of biblical justice, not merely the defeat of evil, but the triumph of righteousness and the flourishings of those who remain faithful to God's covenant. But the Song of Deborah accomplished something beyond artistic expression or historical preservation. It became a template for how Israel would remember and celebrate divine deliverance throughout their history. The patterns established in this ancient poem would influence Hebrew worship and literature for centuries to come, providing a model for how God's people could give voice to their deepest experiences of faith, struggle, and triumph. Deborah's story stands as a timeless testament to the power of unwavering faith and courageous leadership. From her court under the palm tree to the muddy battlefield, where chariots became death traps, she demonstrated that God's calling transcends every human limitation and expectation. Her legacy reminds us that true authority flows not from position or power, but from faithful obedience to divine purpose. When we face our own impossible odds and overwhelming challenges, may we remember the prophetess who trusted completely, led fearlessly, and sang triumphantly of God's faithfulness to those who answer his "Oh, oh."